Something else I've noticed as well, and again, these are just kind of my own meandering experiences. It's not from any kind of literature or text or authoritative figures or experts in the field, but I noticed that it's a funny old one, because the document that really did it for me actually was from the literature. It was the question disclosure model. I did a video on that in the Facebook group. But the questions we ask also reveal things about our thinking, where we are. And some questions have valence, some questions have implications, and obviously they reveal what we do and don't know. And sometimes this can be taken advantage of, sometimes it leaves us vulnerable. So it's also a weird, I think, I haven't read any Gregory Bateson or Bertrand Russell, but I get the feeling that this is what they were all about. It's a cybernetic system. It's a feedback. It's a totally codependent system. So in essence, the meaning of the communication is what's been received. But if it's not received, it doesn't have any meaning. So if there's no one to hear your message, there's no point in saying it, because it doesn't even have meaning to yourself. Because the way that the communication is structured seems also to take account of where we perceive the listener to be in their world and their context, and in their relation to us, whether they are perceived to be superior to us in some way or have power over us, whether they're a partner or a subordinate or a child. We structure our communication differently. I think in some of the Bateson literature, he suggested that all communication have two levels of meaning, a report and a command. So if I turn that around and say a command and a report, it sounds very similar to please help, or a perception and a decision. It seems to be the same thing that we've been talking about, but the way Bateson put it was report and command. So I'm trying to think of a contrived example. I consider a situation at work where you have to do some project. I don't know, maybe it's printing out a colour print or making something that uses a lot of resources, and supposing you do it in quite a wasteful way. A boss might come to you and say, hey, wow, I noticed that you were doing that project and you did it in quite an inefficient way. Next time, can you be more mindful about making better use or utilising the resources in a way that isn't so wasteful, i.e. optimized. So we might think of like a simple example. I know maybe it's printing out a document that uses one of those old-fashioned colour cartridges, and you're just printing pages of blue text and it just depletes the colour cartridge and you have to throw it all away, even though you haven't used the other 3 colour inks in that cartridge. I know now we use separate ink cartridges. That kind of thing. You think, oh, okay, in the context of business, yes, this is bad. I'm going to amend my ways. The boss is paying me to do work, and I do work how the boss says. Yeah, sure, okay, I'll be more mindful. Now change the context to a home situation where, let's think of a really contrived example. You're making a cup of tea and you insist on filling the kettle up full, 2 litres full, boiling it just to make your cup of tea every time, and it takes the full 3 minutes for the kettle to boil. And your partner comes and says, hey, I noticed when you make a cup of tea, you fill the kettle right up with water. That's quite an inefficient use of resources. I was wondering if in the future you wouldn't be mindful about being more efficient in your use of electricity. It's not going to go down so well, is it? Why? What's the difference? The difference is in the nature of the relationship. The difference is in the assumption made in the communication. The first position, the first example, it was appropriate. He is the boss. To some extent, boss pays people for people to do work for him, and the conditions of the work are pretty much what the boss wants you to do. You do because that's what he's paying you to do. If he's a good boss, gives you certain autonomy over how you achieve that, because it's presumed, I suppose, you are the expert, you're the best person for the job, and that's why you were hired. Occasionally, you might need guidance on things that are new. In the second case, where one says to the other in a husband and wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, partner relationship, it has the same tone about it. So when one says to the other about being excessive in their use of resources by making a cup of tea, and would they mind being more economical, it presumes the same kind of hierarchy. I'm the boss, you're the underling. It has the same language structure. And so there's that meta-communication. So the person may have been receptive to the message, but they didn't like the way that the message was conveyed. And so to then adopt the new behavior confirms or acknowledges or submits to the presumed hierarchy. So of course we can't do it. We can't comply. It's not that the message was wrong. It's the implication that we don't accept. So rather than saying, hey, I don't like the way you expressed that, because of course it's a trivial matter. It's just about water in a kettle. And we haven't even got to storming a teacup. We're not even that far ahead. And so we know that if we say, hey, I don't like the way you expressed that, the message we're going to get back is going to be confrontational. Well, I don't care how I expressed it. Dodgy ground. Oh, you seem to be getting upset just about being told about energy efficiency. What's the matter with you? We play these in our minds. And therefore, we might not want to go into argument about that. So the easiest option is just non-compliance. Of course, then it all comes into play. Facial expression, tone, posture. The influence of contempt. And this is why I think trying to be concise about things, getting to the matter of the fact about things, using logic and reason is often flawed, because yes, it makes sense to only boil the amount of water that you want to use. There may be other reasons that we don't know. There may be historical or cultural significance to these rituals or practices that we've just cut off as not important. So there's a saying, and I don't quite get it right, something about slowing down to go more quickly. Something like that. So taking the time to make the time means that it'll take less time. Something, you know what I mean. That's another one of those. I assume that you will. And you is another funny word, isn't it? I mean, the tonality, it changes so much meaning. Are you telling me it isn't true? Okay, that's just maybe a question about fact. Are you telling me it isn't true? That's a question about who are you to tell me, and are you qualified? And you, of all people, think you know that you are able to tell me? Again, it's not a question. That one isn't a question about the information payload. It's a question about the nature of the relationship. So going meta, going really big picture for a moment, one of the questions that Bateson was asking was really, because a lot of modern communication theory, I think, is based on his investigations, ecology of mind, which I think was based on or used a lot of Bertrand Russell's work to do with logical levels of mind. But the big question is, what is the pattern which connects all the living things? And that is to question patterns, relationships, the way things are connected. I haven't looked into it too much, but I suppose, is it graph theory, network theory? How you have nodes and edges and number of connections, and some connections are weighted more than others, this kind of thing. And in a sense that in some way everything is connected. One of Bateson's statements that really kind of struck me was, say for example in evolution, we understand how evolution works. That evolution is a heritable change in populations spread over generations, driven by natural selection. And there's the trick. It's driven by natural selection. So the process is the process, but it's driven by this notion of natural selection. And what is that? Well, it's pressures from the environment. So what Bateson noted was that it's the context which evolves. So I think what he's really getting at here is that there seems to become a misunderstanding that organism changes over time. It's not even that. I mean, I see this, I don't know whether it's a deliberate misunderstanding when creationists going on about asking how a fish can change into a whale or whatever it is. But the point is, a fish doesn't change into a whale. It never did. It never could. The evolutionary process means that something starts out that we classify as something, but there's an infinitesimally small number of changes over a long period of time that then when human beings come along and can categorize one as different from another by morphology, but also through the investigation of genetics and morphology and organisation of clades and common traits and monitoring of the changing allele frequencies, we can say, yes, this organism came through this pathway of clades that leads all the way back to some kind of originator. But as the definition of evolution goes, it's a change in populations. It's the change in populations, not in individual organisms. So what's a populations? Well, it's a context. And I think this is what Bateson was getting at. It's the context which evolves. Just to kind of re-emphasize, it's not, we'll never find one organism that evolved. The evolution process occurs to a whole population. That is to say, we never find one animal that is its own unique species and only contains a set of one. There are many cheetahs, there are many parrots. There's not like one thing of one species. It just can't exist on its own. It's always within a population or within a context that changes, and the context is a reflection of the environment at the time. Same with language. Fascinating how language changes over time, and you can even trace things that happened at the time, the movement of people, and how dialects influenced the change in language, and how that movement was precipitated by chasing of resources, or people moving down from one area of land down into the south where it is richer, and they bring with them their dialects, and it changes, so it has a huge impact on language. It's all there, coded in the history of change. Fascinating stuff. And I suspect big data is also getting into all this, our own digital footprint, every comment we've made, how our interests change over time. And it's not just convenience for you that Facebook asks you about your favourite films or your favourite books or where you are at any given moment. You check in, or, they've got these sections of books you've read, films you went to see, places you've been. What do you think that's really all about? And then there's all these AI bots that go on Twitter and do sentiment analysis. It's all interesting stuff. Basically asks the question, what are people perceiving right now? Given that, we might have a guess as to what decisions they're about to make. Here we are. So these sentiments remind me a bit of Gilles Deleuze when I read some of his books when I was looking at Francis Bacon. It's not that life... I'm forgetting it already. If he was to point to a human being and say, where in that body is life? It's a bit of a malformed question, because it supposes that life is to be found in the body. But this is the thing that I think Russell and Bateson were getting at. It's that life is the emergent phenomenon because the species, animals, creatures, plants perpetuate. So life is the perpetuation. It's not the creature itself. It's not the organism itself. It's the perpetuation that is life. It's an emergent property. It's not really real. It's not actually a thing. It's just a perception of the context, and we call it life. I wish I knew more about linguistics. It's such a fascinating topic, because it seems like it's a key or a gateway or an insight to the mind. But then, again, that's reflexive, because as small children, as babies, we're taught linguistics, and I'm not sure whether the mind leads the linguistics or the linguistics leads the mind. Probably both. There also seems to be a cut-off age that changes the dynamic. So when a child says, there's monsters under my bed, or nobody wants to play with me, it's obvious, almost, the meaning of the communication. I can't sleep, I'm scared, something's bothering me, and nobody wants to play with me, I'm alone or feeling lonely, or I want someone to play with. When adults say these things, it kind of bewilders me. It's like, well, there's monsters. They don't say there's monsters under the bed, but they come up with a more elaborate subterfuge and convoluted way of saying the same thing. And because it's so abstracted now, it's like, where are you coming from, pal? What are you saying to me? Are you really saying you're scared? As an adult, haven't you figured that out, how to deal with that yet? Are you asking for help, or are you being funny? Or it's just weird. It places it in a strange context. And again, imagine an adult saying, no one wants to play with me. It's like, okay, well, I'm sure you know the solutions to these problems. Why haven't you effected change? So to me, it raises even more questions. But I suppose this is the trick. And it changes your perspective on things when you look at all these, businessmen. I mean, look at Mike Bloomberg now. Just take off the business suit and imagine him in the pram. That's the way to look at it. He almost doesn't know what he's talking about in the sense of taking his expertise and applying it elsewhere. It's so out of context. It doesn't make sense. So phrases we might hear from an adult: I've got that big meeting coming up tomorrow. There's monsters under my bed. Or, I called round my friends, or I put a notice on Facebook to see who wants to go and watch Infinity Wars, and no one replied. Same thing, no one wants to play with me. Okay. And this is the bit that I'm really bad at. I struggle with it. The key I realised, it's one thing knowing, it's another thing doing. The key is to realise that there's an implicit appeal to an underlying feeling. And again, I'm a bit wishy-washy on the difference between feelings and emotions. So there's many different types of feelings, as I understand, and they may, I think, link to an expression of a need, and many different kinds of needs. But there's only a few basic emotions: happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, and surprise, and fear. See, let me ask about pride. Do you feel proud? Or do you say, I am proud? So is it an emotional experience, or is it a state of mind? Is there a difference? And then what about things like feeling hungry, the kind of discomfortable sensation in the lower gut region and the kind of psychological screaming for food? Is that a pain, or is it an emotion, or is it a sensation, or is it a feeling? It's a feeling, isn't it? So if it's a feeling, when you say you're hungry, are you expressing a feeling, or is that an emotion? I think it's a feeling, isn't it? And so emotions then are, what are they? Are they conscious or unconscious? I'm gonna go ahead and say that they're probably more unconscious. I think they're more visceral reactions to things that we might have less control about, or certainly a threshold of control beyond which we snap, and then that emotion comes out, whether we snap in anger, or suddenly become sad. Can you suddenly become sad? Maybe. I don't know if there's a threshold, or whether there's an amplification that takes time, or it's like some capacitance that builds up, or it's more like an inductive process. Doesn't seem as though but can you suddenly become happy? Suddenly? Or is it, you need precognition to lead up to it? So if emotions are more unconscious, then it seems as though it makes sense that the emotional responses are when things like our unconscious framework, like our beliefs or our values, are challenged or violated, or our desires curtailed, or our actions challenged, because surely our actions are a result of our unconscious values and belief stack, our identity. It's not always in our conscious mind of, my identity as a doctor means that I do this behaviour every day. It's like driving a car. Sure, at first it's very prescribed, very instructional, very process driven, but after a while it becomes an unconscious thing, and we develop an unconscious style of driving. And then we get road rage when someone violates or interrupts or does something that we perceive as dangerous and reckless and disrespectful to us. So we always seem to have different boundaries of what we might find as acceptable driving, some which is unacceptable, and some which is downright dangerous and deliberately dangerous. Of course, the other driver just might be on drugs. We can never know. But we still get that emotional reaction: road rage, anger. So again, the theory seems to be that to improve understanding is to listen for the implicit feelings in what other people say, and I suppose it becomes more explicit when they exhibit an emotion. They're easier to pick up on for me. Sadness, anger, fear, happiness, disgust, and surprise, contempt. Just to throw that in there, they're easy to spot. Feelings of malaise, it's harder to identify, because there seems to be an evaluation in the feeling. The emotion seems to be more raw, more obvious, more last resort, as it were, but a feeling is conscious control, it seems to me anyway. It's a conscious response to something, and the response maybe is, again, a function of the perception and the decision. So there's some evaluation that causes a reaction or a decision about things, but it's harder to spot, and I think this is the process of good communication, is being able to identify those. So if you go to the child who's on the bed shivering out of fright and fear, that's quite obvious. If they say, there's monsters under my bed, it's less obvious, but reasonably clear about what's going on. I've got that big meeting coming up tomorrow. Okay, that could mean many things. Is it a time constraint? Are you unprepared? Is it nervousness? A big meeting? Is there lots of people going to be there? Is it a problem of getting to the location? Is it that the room isn't big enough for everybody in it? You can attack it on so many different ways. Big meeting. Why did they specify big? Coming up means it's imminent, it's close. But they also said tomorrow. So, of course it's imminent because it's tomorrow, but they specified coming up. So why did they qualify tomorrow with coming up tomorrow? Why is that? What's the significance of big and coming up? I can't quite put it together. So I might guess there's apprehension here about something, but what that is unclear. But again, tonality, imagine they said, I've got that big meeting coming up tomorrow. It's like, okay, they sound jazzed up that they're going to sell a lot of business and they're looking forward to it. An opportunity that's coming up, a big opportunity. But then if you say, yeah, I've got that big meeting coming up tomorrow, it's like, apprehension. So it's the tonality as well is a guide when statements like this are so ambiguous. Again, for some reason, I'm the last to find out about things in the office. I'm always the last one to find out. So if there was more context to this person's description of the meeting tomorrow, that they had been working on it for the last year, that might change their context, might change my perspective of their situation, but there's still an implicit meaning which isn't clear. And it's certainly a problem. Again, I keep going on about personality types, INTJ, or more internal. So I'll take their external expression and apply it to my internal set of rules in my internal world. And then instead of putting me in their shoes, I put them in my shoes and say, okay, if they were me, what would my concerns be? And then I project that out rather than saying, okay, let me step in their shoes. It's very unnatural, I think, for introverts to kind of do that exercise. I suppose it's also quite taxing as well. It takes a lot of energy. So if it is true to say that the primary emotions are happiness, sadness, anger, disgust, surprise, and fear, then during any conversation or any interaction or questioning or feedback, if we know we're going to have a difficult situation, a difficult conversation, then we ought to be prepared for what are going to be these reactions. So we might say, okay, it's going to be an awkward conversation coming up. If the person is happy, what will I do? If they respond with sadness, what shall I do? If they are angry, what should I do? If they exhibit disgust, what should I do? And if it's a surprise and fear, how should I handle that? It seems a bit crazy to go into a conversation or into a situation where you haven't planned for certain responses. So you're going to get one of those 6, but which you don't know. So it might just be worth sometimes doing a quick, if they respond with anger, what shall I do? What shall I say? How shall I tackle that? What do I need to do to get them back on track if they respond with anger? If they respond with disgust, what is my response to that? Same with happiness, sadness, surprise. And I think even with happiness, because it's an emotion that we would find pleasing in appropriate context, we kind of let that one ride. But also we can take advantage of that and say, okay, if they do respond with happiness, how would I respond so that it can be amplified? If they respond with sadness, is that appropriate? Do I need to multiply that as well, or do I need to mitigate? By the same token, it's perhaps worth running through that list as well for ourselves in response to something that someone else might say. If we catch ourselves going down those emotions, what's our response? Do we just indulge in anger, or do we say, oh, okay, I feel anger coming on, something's conflicted with an internal value, or I've been misunderstood in a way that I find repugnant, and I'm going to batter this person to death. And if I recognise myself saying that, then perhaps I ought to do this instead, or change my tactic. So it takes a lot of time, it's a lot of effort, and that's the thing, isn't it? We always want to I suppose, pick the perfect time to have these conversations, but it never seems to occur. But there does seem to be certain places, certain times, certain decorum. You do it certain things person to person. You don't have the heart to heart in a movie theatre when the movie's playing. You pick your time and place. And that can change the efficacy and effectiveness of a communication as well. Context. And another thing that I kind of wrap myself up in problems, I see communication a bit like playing chess, and we talked about this with Waitskin when we started this channel a few months ago, when we looked at Waitskin and his playing chess and Dweck and learning the art of Zen, or was it Zen and the art of archery? And how Waitskin talked about his process of learning chess, that yes, the basic instructions, the rules of chess are each player takes it in turns to make a move. A move is governed by very simple rules that the pieces move in certain configurations, and with very rare exceptions to the rule like castling and the move and pass by a pawn, the rules are, well, they're all well defined, but it's just knowing a couple of exceptions. Off you go and win. I mean, you've got the rules, go and win. Well, and this always irritates me so much when I hear the message of learn by your mistakes. So you play your first game of chess and you lose. Okay, what were your mistakes? Well, which single mistake led to the loss? Well, all of them. Which ones ought to be corrected? Well, all of them. What does that look like then when it's a winning position? What are the winning moves to make that result in a win? Don't know. Go and find out. Well, they're almost infinite. Yes, that's true. So how do you win at chess? Play better than the other person. Okay, what are the moves I need to make? Well, the moves that offer greater advantage than the other person. Okay, and what are they then? Don't know. So how do I find out? Go and play. And communication to me seems a very similar endeavour. There's certain rules, but it's a reciprocation. You can't play it without the other player, and the other player is always different, acting at different levels of sophistication, different perception filters, different decision strategies, different metaphors, different social context, different cultural context, reservations about saying things in polite company, different euphemisms. But there seems to be a few basic ground rules. If you want to be an effective communicator, make people feel you're interested in them and what they have to say. Think about what you want to say whilst others are talking. Acknowledge what the other speaker says. Don't always jump in before the other person's speaking. To some degree, allow people to complain without judgment. Don't go giving advice necessarily before you're asked. Try and work out what people are trying to say, not just responding to the words. Experiences are always different, so just because they've had an experience, the mechanics of something that is similar doesn't necessarily equate to a similar experience. It seems that getting other people to tell you about themselves also adds context, and that seems important. Don't always assume that you know what someone's going to say before they've said it. Restate messages to make sure you've understood correctly. Don't necessarily make judgments about who's worth listening to and who isn't. Realise that listening is a skill that is acquired through practice. And I'm fuzzy, but respecting what people have to say seems to be important. But some people say the dumbest shit. Some people say things that are downright dangerous as well, and encourage other people to take on those beliefs. So I can't really respect what they say. There's obviously a deep psychological need for them to spread the word of this bullshit that's out there in the blogosphere about vaccines and GMO and all the other conspiracy theories. I haven't quite worked that one out yet, but there is an underlying need. And perhaps because they're not being listened to, they try and find these secrets that other people don't know, and then they can spread these secrets. And through that differential of information and knowledge asymmetry, they can position themselves as someone who's special, who's done research, who's looked into this, who's thought about it deeply, and that they've come up with this knowledge. But I've also realised that they're not coming up with anything original, that it's not their own thoughts, that often they're just repeating what someone else has said that they think sounds clever. So it's not even that they've thought of it, they're just repeating it. So it doesn't even qualify as what they would say is research. It's just repeating what someone else has said. It's repeating obscure and esoteric information. Maybe that some of it's correct, maybe that it's not correct. But they seem to have made no endeavour to test its veracity or effectiveness or truthfulness. They just want to repeat it. Yeah, so again, another rule seems to be not to tell people that you know how they feel, even if you're right. It diminishes the experience of them investigating it and telling you. Because if you are that mind reader and you are able to tell what people feel and you fully understand from the very first word that they've said, it makes you a superhuman and in that respect unrelatable. And then it's very difficult for them to tell their experience of what might be a naive situation or what might be a very fundamental thing that they're struggling with. And by fundamental in that context, I mean something very basic that should have been a fundamental that they ought to have grasped 20 years ago, but for whatever reason in their life experience never brought them into contact with that, and they have a really big hole in their cognition. And, telling a superhuman about this, what they're going to turn around and say, well, we might worry about that, and there's another blocker. So sometimes just taking that responsibility as well, by asking, are you afraid as to what I might reply with? Let's talk about that. Get that out of the way. It removes another blockade. So yeah, these things I'm really shit at, and I don't know why. I really struggle with it. It's just, it wears you down. I don't know how therapists do it. It just, maybe it's the circles I'm walking in, but it's just a constant torrent of shit. And it's not that it's any kind of new shit that you can get excited about. It's the same old crap cropping up time and time again. Points refuted 1,000 times before. The Pratt list. But I think that reveals something about my psychology, rather than going, this is number 400 on the Pratt list and I have a solution for that. Let me roll it out. Here it is. Job done. Move on. Let me set someone else straight. It's a case of, oh no, not again. So I got a pretty shitty outlook on life, but that's my bag.